So not too long ago, I did a review on the Resident Evil 2 remake, and it was easily the biggest and most ambitious review I've ever done. I mean, hell, it was the first time I ever did a video that was longer than 25 minutes, let alone almost being 50 minutes for Christ's sakes. As far as I'm concerned, it definitely deserved a video that long dedicated to it. It did so many things right that all the while still being its own thing and gave a reason for the original to exist due to how radically different they are despite both of them being Resident Evil 2. So I figured, well, I looked at the remake, it's only right to look at the game that was responsible for the Resident Evil 2 remake even being a thing, and man does it have a legacy. As I mentioned before, Resident Evil 2 is kind of an anomaly to me. Despite having games like Resident Evil 1 Remake, Resident Evil 4, hell even this game's remake, all of which could be considered the best in the series for various reasons. The original Resident Evil 2, it's still a title in this franchise that's considered by many to be the pinnacle of the series, and that's including its remake. That's quite the reputation to have, especially considering that unlike those other titles, it's still for all intent and purposes a PS1 game that doesn't have all the refinements the later entries would have. It doesn't have the beautiful graphics like the remakes do. It doesn't have the more approachable game design like Resident Evil 4 would have. Hell, it doesn't even have the quick turn mechanic Resident Evil 3 has. So what the hell is it about this game that has managed to stand the test of time? Well, while it might be rough around the edges, and there are certain aspects that I don't think the game did too well, but in my opinion, much like the others have said, as a sequel, it's everything you could have ever wanted. To go back to the original Resident Evil 1, ooh, that's an experience. And when you do, it makes you appreciate just how much of an improvement everything really was at the time. Graphically, it was a major step above what came before. Everyone here looks a hell of a lot better, much less blocky and more fluid in animations, which while kind of basic even back then, it still has that retro charm to it that can never be replicated. And the RPD station was such a memorable and distinct location that you'll never find anywhere else. Claire, Leon, and Ada were great additions to the cast of characters, and for a while it was like a different perspective you got to differentiate yourself from the STARS counterpart. Hell, Leon would essentially become the de facto poster boy for the series, and Ada, oh my god. People are just waiting for the day when Capcom finally decides to do a game that focuses solely on her as the lead role, something that I'm actually surprised hasn't happened yet. Of course, so any Resident Evil game worth their weight has a great cast of enemies and villains, and they definitely didn't sleep on it this time around. The zombies have made a return and look so much better than what was offered before. Just like the main characters, no longer are they these blocky monsters that only range from maybe 4 variants. Now there's a decent selection of them and they are just as intimidating as ever. Especially now since game loves throwing a bunch of them at you all at once and from all angles. On harder difficulties, this can definitely feel tense at points. I especially love though that you can blow parts of their bodies off. For many of the games, the most you're doing is maybe making their heads explode, which is always satisfying when it happens, mind you. But how about being able to potentially blow off half their torso alongside their head? Ooh, fuck me, that is satisfying. But of course, that's just zombies. The Cerberuses and giant spiders make a return, alongside one of the series' most infamous BOWs being the Lickers, which debuted in 2. Referred to as the Inside Out Men by Sherry in the novel, these skinless creatures were truly terrifying for its time. They can't see you, but they can hear, and god, they are fast little bastards that can kill you quickly if you're not careful. They're also pretty silent, which can lead to some jump scares when they pop out of nowhere on screen. It's great stuff. There were also the Ivies in the lab section, which while kinda cartoony by today's standards, I will admit they were a great addition to diversify the enemy selection, and even now they're still kinda creepy to look at, knowing what they're based on. In terms of bosses, obviously the standouts would be William Burke in his different phases, as well as Mr. X. William was always a really cool villain since while you play, you would face off against him at different points, and it was always so cool to find out what form he would take next. He's straight up a Dragon Ball Z character, and I love it. Mr. X, on the other hand, while kinda cool as a concept, he would essentially act as a secondary villain to stalk the player. As I mentioned in the past, once you realize that you could easily run past him and he'll disappear after you leave the room, definitely kinda deflates his imposing vibe. But ironically, after reading the S.D. Perry novel, I grew more of an appreciation for this version of him. Cause I mean sure, yes, he is exploitable, but he adds a third-party element. You already know about Birkin and feel like he could pop up at any point, but Mr. X adds essentially a second version of Birkin. 2 characters stalking Leon and Claire throughout their journey for survival. Sure, it's all scripted in terms of gameplay, it's just another obstacle, but in terms of vibe and atmosphere for the first time player, that fucker could pop up anywhere and do some damage if you're not careful. It's a factor we didn't see in the original, and it would be greatly expanded upon in the next game. So while I might enjoy him a lot more in the remake, I still appreciate what he is, and it also led to one of my favorite parts about the remake, so I'm definitely grateful for Mr. X. Now, probably the thing Resident Evil 2 was best known for was the Game A and Game B mechanic, where you played through the game once, and then on the same save file, you would play through it again as the other character, but from their perspective, leading to essentially a second campaign where you would start at a different entry point, and would have to explore the RPD differently, providing a somewhat new experience. The reason why this mode is so beloved is due to the fact that what you do in Game A would affect certain events in Game B, such as item expansions in the locker, whether you'd have to fight the giant alligator again, etc. Not only did it provide a proper second campaign that you could mix and match depending on who you started with, it also made your actions a lot more important since it could determine whether Game B was going to be harder or easier. It's an aspect of Resident Evil 2 that has been beaten to death. It's a great mechanic that not only made the story narrative much more interesting and impactful, but greatly made the gameplay much more dynamic. And surprisingly, wasn't an idea that would be explored much after this. Hell, as much as I love the Resident Evil 2 remake, not having a true A-B scenario hurt it, and for some people it meant the remake was a lesser experience than the original. I personally feel that the game was good even without it, but it's a valid argument against the remake, cause it is a glaring omission. Hell, even for the original remake I feel they should have incorporated something like the A-B scenario, instead of having Chris and Jill do the exact same playthrough with minor differences. So there's a lot to like about this game, and I haven't even talked about the bonus modes like Fourth Survivor or Extreme Battle Mode. Both are great bonus modes that add a lot of replay value. But for as much good as this game does, it's not perfect. And for me personally, the couple things it doesn't do good keeps it from being the best game in the series in my opinion. First off, the difficulty. To me, Resident Evil 2 is probably one of the easiest games in the series. I don't know, maybe it's because I've been playing these games for well over a decade now, and I've just gotten to the point where I feel many of them are easy, but Resident Evil 2 especially can feel like a cakewalk. And when I'm not feeling the tension or challenge in a Resident Evil game, that does put a damper on the experience a little bit. I'm definitely well past the scare factor that most of these games struggle to provide to begin with, so I'd like to feel at least some challenge to build up that tension during gameplay. But unfortunately, that's not the only other main element classic Resident Evil is known for, and that's its puzzles, or lack of, I should say. To me, if you want a game in this series to feel like classic survival horror, then interesting puzzles are a must. It's something that helps break up the action, makes you feel like you gotta think at points, adding an element that makes the gameplay feel a lot more engaging. Well, Resident Evil 2 loves its fetch quests, but when it comes to actual puzzles, it's damn near non-existent, and the ones they do have are beyond laughably easy. Push these buttons to make the shelves move to exactly what the picture shows, or light these candles in a specific pattern that won't take more than a few tries to get through, just by forcing your way through with trial and error. It's funny, a lot of fans like to say Resident Evil needs to be like this or it's not true Resident Evil, but when you see stuff like this, or just how outrageous and over-the-top Code Veronica was, it's like even as early as 2, the series had a focus on action. When you really look at it objectively, it's no wonder the series went where it did for a while. Yet, you know, that's a bit of a no-no word when it comes to the diehards, and you should never be taken seriously if you even consider acknowledging that. But my cynical side aside, it's very easy to see why this game has the legacy it's had for the past 20 years. For every element that might feel dated or rough around the edges, it's making it up by doing 10 other things right, and in my opinion, if you're looking for a starting point and don't want to get your ass handed to you right out of the gate, well, I would actually recommend Resident Evil 1 Remake, as I think that's probably the better title to get you hooked. But Resident Evil 2 is another valid option too. It does more than enough right where I can recommend it as a starting point for a new player. And if you haven't played Resident Evil 2 yet, then you're missing out because it's one of those games that is one of those legacy titles that any gamer should play at least once in their lifetime. Might not be perfect, but it's definitely worth your attention.